So, for me, the last thing that I wanted to be was a gay man because growing up in a very Christian fundamentalist family, Southern Baptist, Southern Methodist background, that was said in many instances by adults around me that it was worse than being a murderer to be a homosexual. But it became clear to me through various circumstances that, what I was gay. I mean, one of the early indications of that for me was watching the movie Rebel Without a Cause. And when Salminio was in the picture, I felt funny. And at the time, being a 7-year-old kid, I didn't figure out what that was all about. Later on in life, in my teens, as I began in junior high school to find myself attracted to my male classmates, it began to make sense to me that what I was feeling was a sexual attraction for Salminio in the movie. I didn't want to feel that sexual attraction. In fact, at one point in high school, I came up with this mantra that I would say to myself often on the way to school. I'm attracted to women, I'm not attracted to men. I'm attracted to girls, I'm not attracted to boys. And I thought maybe by saying this mantra over and over again that I would change. For years, I really fought against the feelings that I had for other men. I remember when I was in college, freshman orientation, where there was one table set up for the Afro-American Students Organization, and then there was another table that was set up for the Graduate Homophile Association. It was the first year at Harvard that they actually had a Graduate Homophile Association, and they were obviously signing up members. And I remember being conflicted about whether I should go to the Afro table or whether I should go to the Graduate Homophile Association table. It never occurred to me that I could do both. And so I went to the Afro table and signed up and did not go to the Graduate Homophile Association table to sign up. And that was a reflection of how I handled being, a gay man who was not out when I was in college. I remember in the South hearing the expression that, a rooster who has no interest in a hen is only worth being made into chicken salad. And I didn't want to be that person, okay? And so I really fought against it for years, to the point where in my 20s, in dealing with that issue and other issues, I really became very anxious and very depressed. This resulted in me, having to get into therapy to try to sort things through. And, it was while I was in therapy that I found out that people in my I wasn't the only one in my circumstances, that there were other people who had the same kinds of issues and that I could work them through. And at the same time, when I would come home to Philadelphia, I would sneak down to what's now called the gayborhood and hang out in various, quote, peep shows, unquote, to see what was happening. So I wasn't completely in the closet in terms of all of my activities. There were still times when I would, as I say, sort of venture out. It wasn't until I went back to medical school, after taking some time off to sort things through, that once again, very strong urge to be with other men came about. My first year, I was sort of in a maintaining mode with respect to coming out. I wasn't going to come out, but I was feeling the urge to come out. And then beginning of my second year, I really felt it strongly. A number of my classmates in medical school in Carolina were gay, and I spent my time with them. I went out of my way to make friends with them, and we became friends. And we never discussed the whole gay issue directly, but we just hung out together and had good times. When I came back to Carolina for Christmas, some friends of mine and they had invited me, my gay friends had invited me to brunch with them. And just all of a sudden, one of them said, "Well, Harold, you're no dumb bunny. You know what's going on around here." And I'm going like, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, we're all gay." and we suspect that you're gay as well. And I said, of course I am. So obviously we all came out to each other. You know, we were all hugging, kissing. I was crying because, you know, suddenly I felt a sense of relief. They told me where all the, quote, hot spots were in the area where, you know, gays would hook up and everything. And I started going to those areas. The thing was that it was the South, and this was like 1981, 1982. I found out that there was a lot of prejudice still around, even in the gay community. My friends and I would make plans to meet up at the bar, and you know, we'd say plan to meet up at 9 o'clock. And I'd show up at 9 o'clock, and the door person would tell me I needed a membership in order to get into the club. Not having a membership, of course, I couldn't get in. So when I saw my friends on Monday or Tuesday, I said, well, hey, you know, you have to have a membership to get into that club. And they said, well, we don't have memberships, and we were there waiting for you. What happened? And so I told them what had happened. As it turned out, the one club in particular, I had one of the people who worked at Carolina was friends with the owner, and the owner's take on it was that too many African-American men in the bar caused the white gay men to feel that they didn't want to be there. And so his rationale was it was bad for his business. You know, while I did come out, while there were some places I could go to, I didn't feel really free, as it were, because I recognized there were limitations in terms of where I could go and where I would be welcomed. In thinking back on it, it made me realize that even among people who are oppressed because of what they are, in this case being gay, they still may not have the sensitivity to understand that being bigoted or prejudiced against other people because of skin color, for example, is not the right thing to do, and can be as hurtful and as painful as you know, being a gay man that's who's dealing with a situation in which they're being considered less than and being prejudiced against. So that was a painful revelation for me, but it was also something that I learned to deal with time. Spring of 1982, I finished my second year in medical school and wanted to check out the West Coast. Had some friends who lived in San Francisco who'd invited me out to visit with them. And as it turned out, they helped me get an externship at a medical center in East Palo Alto, California, which is some 30 miles south of San Francisco. And so I had a chance to spend 6 to 8 weeks doing my externship in the Bay Area. And of course, as a gay man who really relatively new coming out, coming to San Francisco was a revelation. I found it to be a lot more open than North Carolina was. I found people to be a lot more welcoming. I made very good friends there pretty easily. For the most part, I was able to go to various clubs without any difficulty. The first club I ever went into was a place called the Pendulum, which, as it turns out, was a bar where everybody went. All kinds of people, descriptions, ethnic backgrounds, sizes, everything. I met a whole bunch of very wonderful people and became friends with them, and they began to tell me about living in San Francisco and what it was like. I decided that I had arrived, so to speak. I had found a place where I could be comfortable living. I felt really for the first time in my life socially and sexually very secure. Made it a whole lot easier in terms of not only getting to know friends, but also getting to have boyfriends, etc. And so after that 8-week externship, I decided this is where I want to go. This is where I want to come, rather, for my training. About a year later, in 1983, I spent 3 months doing externships at San Francisco General Hospital through the University of California, San Francisco, in part because I wanted to hopefully get a residency in psychiatry at UCSF. The doors really were open pretty wide for me at that point. And I made even more friends. I got even more connected in terms of the San Francisco community, felt even more included overall. My internship and residency ended up being in Torrance, California, which was part of UCLA Medical Center's system. But I spent a lot of time going back and forth between San Francisco and Long Beach, where I was living, because most of my friends were in San Francisco. Not that I didn't have friends in the LA area, I did. But LA struck me as being a whole lot more focused on how much money you have, do you look like Adonis, et cetera, compared to San Francisco, which seemed more inclusive overall. And so I spent I spent a lot of time in San Francisco, even though I was living in the LA area. Not to say the LA didn't have a lot to offer now, because there was, of course, West Hollywood and the various, bars in West Hollywood. I got associated with Black White Men Together while I was in LA, and, every week on Saturdays, we would have rap sessions where we'd sit around and talk about various things, including things like racism and classism, sizeism, sexism, the whole bit. And I really got to know a wonderful group of people in LA as well. Met a person that I ended up spending most of my internship year with, as a partner. And, that relationship was very important to me in helping me to get through my internship, because as you can imagine, the internship year is hell on wheels basically. And to have someone, at home to come home to and be there to help comfort me was really important. Had it not been for that relationship, I probably would not have made it as smoothly through my internship as I actually did. And I was very fortunate, to have that person in my life for that year. But I always look forward to moving to San Francisco to live, because that's where I wanted to be. That's where I really wanted to be, and that's where I really felt I could be myself. When I finished my residency in 1988, I had been making some inquiries about psychiatry positions in the Bay Area, and as it turned out, one of my preceptors at my residency, his wife was the director of mental health in San Mateo County, and she needed a psychiatrist. And so everything just fell into place, and I ended up working in East Palo Alto in part-time at the clinic I had done my externship with 6 years before, and part-time at the county mental health clinic, where basically I was doing the same thing, seeing people, medication evaluations, doing therapy, etc. I lived in San Francisco from 1988 to 1998, and then in 1998 I moved to Oakland and lived in Oakland for 13 years until 2011. There is no other place on this planet like San Francisco. I mean, there are large populations of gay people in various other cities, but there's no city like San Francisco. For me, as someone who was coming from the North Carolina experience, and someone who grew up believing that being a gay person was abnormal and somehow bad, to be in an environment where it's quite normal and where it's considered to be good, and beyond considering it to be good is special, is just very, very important. There's this light that gets turned on inside me that gets turned on nowhere else I have been, not even in the neighborhood in Philadelphia. It is just a very special place. The people who are there I have found, are just wonderful and loving and kind and considerate. Not that there aren't loving, kind, and considerate people here in Philadelphia, but there seems to be a higher concentration of that kind of person in San Francisco, and I love it. So I was in the Pendulum one night, and the place was festive and rocking as it usually was. And I was sitting there, and someone sent me a drink. The bartender pointed out who had sent me the drink, and I moved over to where he was, and we started talking. And one thing led to another, and we went back to the place I was staying together and spent the night together. And we exchanged addresses, and I always exchanged phone numbers. And I got a letter from him, saying that he thought I was a very special person, and he wanted to spend more time with me. And I wrote him back and said, the feeling is very much mutual. And so we started, commuting back and forth. He lived in Salinas. I lived in Long Beach at that point. And so we just started commuting back and forth. One weekend I would go to Salinas, one weekend he would come to Long Beach. And for most of a year, that's, the way, that's how we spent time together. We just had, a wonderful, wonderful relationship. Very loving, very kind, very warm, very gentle person. In fact, I have a bear he gave me that has a locket on it that says, "Here's looking at you," and his picture's inside the locket. And that was one of the many very sweet things that he did for me in the time that we were together. And he wanted to move in with me in Long Beach. So I said, "Look, let's wait until I move to San Francisco and see if the relationship lasts, at that point. If it does, then we'll know it's for real. This is all in my head." And he was very sad about that because he really loved me and he wanted to spend more time with me. And, he wanted to build a life together. After about a year of us being together, we were actually at the movie The Princess Bride, and he asked me, "What would you do if I broke up with you?" And I said, "Well, I'd be heartbroken, of course, and it'd be very difficult to deal with." And we went back to his place, we were having dinner. He said, "Well, I have to break up with you because it's too hard, being away from somebody you love so much, and, you can't, you don't want to move to Long Beach with you, and, that's something I really want to do, but, I really need to find somebody that I can be with more than I'm with you." And I left, actually, and got a hotel room and basically, was very devastated. I would see him in San Francisco with, his new boyfriend, et cetera. And, I had moved on as well in terms of being in relationships with other people, but never to the extent that I was in relationship with him. And, I really missed him. We were cordial. There was no bitterness or anger or anything. We still spoke to each other, et cetera. And I was happy for him because he seemed to be happy. But a few years on, I got, a call from him that, things weren't going well in his relationship. His partner was cheating on him. His partner was being abusive. I was in a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, and, I was only using one bedroom. The other bedroom was my den, and I told him, "Look, if you want to come and live with me, no strings attached, no charges, et cetera, I just would, love to to have you in a safe place rather than being in a place where you're being abused." He eventually did break up with this guy and moved back home to be with his parents. And that's when we, began to see each other again, rekindled the relationship that we had. He, at that point, had been diagnosed with AIDS and was living in a housing situation where guys who had AIDS were being taken care of basically by the people who ran this particular program, et cetera. And so he couldn't move out and move in with me at that point. But, we saw each other a lot, usually every weekend, and spent a lot of time together. And it was interesting. One of the things that had happened when we were together was that his parents had wanted to meet me. And his father was from Arkansas, and his mother was from Mississippi. And, well, Terrence was white, and of course I'm African American. And they were not happy about their son being gay at all, but dating an African American was something that they really had difficulty with. When he got sick and we got back together, and, I was there for him, he told me that they told him that he would have been better off staying with Harold than going with this other guy, which to me was an affirmation of the fact that they recognized that, I loved him. We had a good couple of years together, and he was telling me at various points that he knew he wasn't going to live long. I didn't want to hear it and I didn't want to accept that fact. For example, we went to see the renovated Monterey Bay Aquarium, and it was saying, we'll open in 1996. This was like 1992, latter part. And he's saying, well, I won't be around to see that. And I'm going like, don't say that. Just don't think that way. But he knew what was going on with his own body, and he passed away in July of 1993 at the ripe old age of 27. It was very, very devastating, very difficult to deal with, that this loving spirit had moved on, but I grew to accept it. And the thing that I did that really helped me let go was I went and bought 12 roses, and at the Russian River, there's a place called Goat Rock where the Russian River flows into the Pacific Ocean, where something smaller becomes part of something much bigger. And a lot of people go there to remember people who have passed on. And I took my 12 roses and dropped them in the Russian River and watched them flow out into the Pacific. And I got this very strong sense of peace and a very strong sense of calm, that Terrence was okay, he wasn't suffering anymore, that he was now part of something bigger, and he was at peace, and that I ought to be at peace. And that took a lot of the pain away. There's no question that Terrence was, the love of my life, of all the other people that I've been with, because, he was the one who, it seemed to me, saw me for who I really was as a person, the very special person that, I was and am. And he verbalized that a lot. That to me is something that comes along, well, maybe for some people it comes along more than once in a lifetime, but for me it's come along once in a lifetime, and I'm very grateful to God for it. Because he just had a burning love for Harold, and he let it be known. So one of the things that happened rather quickly when I moved to San Francisco was that I got involved with various organizations dealing with various, quote, politics with respect to the gay community, especially with respect to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Part of that involvement included my working with San Francisco Black Coalition on AIDS. One of the things we realized pretty quickly was that in terms of the population of people being involved in clinical trials, that there weren't many men of color involved in those clinical trials. It involved ultimately having the Black Caucus in Congress, which was one of the most supportive organizations, or groups I should say, within Congress with respect to HIV/AIDS related research, writing legislation saying that basically organizations receiving federal dollars needed to have people of color on their research oversight committees, and also that in terms of the participants in the clinical trials, that those participants needed to be reflective of the community that the trials are being held in. And this is the early 90s, when the AIDS epidemic was still raging. Because of the federal oversight and federal legislation, more and more you had men of color and women being included in these clinical trials, as well as having people of color included in the oversight boards that oversaw the clinical research. We also had the advent in the early 90s of needle exchange programs. And I was fortunate enough to have interaction with various people out of New York who were starting needle exchanges in New York and beginning to see some indication that in terms of reducing spread of HIV, Hep B, Hep C, et cetera, that those needle exchanges were effective. And so San Francisco AIDS Foundation established a 501c4 board that was basically responsible for overseeing the needle exchange programs in San Francisco. And the programs expanded from San Francisco to Oakland to Berkeley, etc. And over time, as people did research into this area, we had the hard science that showed very clearly that the needle exchange programs could reduce the transmission of HIV, Hep C, Hep B, etc. So I was very fortunate to be able to be involved in those things back in the early 90s, really using my medical training to back up the politics that I had, which is something I always wanted to do. And one of the difficulties we had early on in San Francisco was that, but not just in San Francisco, also in New York, many social advocates in the African American community, began to say, well, this is just another way of pushing IV drug abuse or IV drug use into the African American community. Because I was a physician in San Francisco, when I was able to say to people things like, well, first of all, if you're concerned about people getting into drug rehab, there is no drug rehab in the grave. So the first thing is you have to keep people alive. So that means you need to cut down on the transmission of potentially deadly infections like HIV/AIDS at that point. And one way to do that is with needle exchange. And the other thing is we can use needle exchange as a bridge to treatment for people, not only in terms of drug rehab treatment, but also in terms of general medical treatment that people would not be getting if in fact they weren't involved in a needle exchange program. Over time, the people who had opposed needle exchange, and it took years, but over time, people in the African American community who had opposed needle exchange, when they saw the scientific evidence, began to be less vocal. In terms of other, gay political things that I got involved with, there was the issue of, there were some bars in San Francisco, particularly in the Castro, who were exclusive with respect to not wanting to have large numbers of African American men in their bar. And so often what people would do would be to ask, if a white person came up, they'd ask for one ID, if that. Okay, if an African American or Latinx man came through, they'd want 3 IDs or 4 IDs. We knew about this, and so again, through connections in the community, we went to the Board of Supervisors and said, this is happening in San Francisco. This shouldn't be happening in San Francisco. One piece of valid ID should be enough for everybody. And the Board of Supervisors passed a law basically saying that in the city of San Francisco, city and county of San Francisco, that one piece of ID, one piece of valid ID was sufficient to allow the entrance of a person into a place where ID was required. That began to open up more of the bars and other establishments that had been exclusive with respect to trying to exclude African American men. Having gone back there to visit 20 plus 30 years later, I can tell you that the Castro is a much more inclusive place than it was when I was there 20 or 30 years ago. And I think some of that has to do with some of the efforts that we were making at that time. I think some of it has to do with what I call the Obama effect. You had an African American president who was very much an advocate with respect to many HIV, many LGBTQ related issues. I think that had overall a positive effect in terms of helping some people who might not have wanted to be more inclusive to be more inclusive. My grandmother always used to say, people can't ride your back unless you bend over. You have to stand up for yourself. If you see something is wrong with respect to how people are being treated, it's your responsibility to call attention to that and then to do what you can do. That's simply what I was acting out in all of those areas where I decided to get involved. So for me, it goes back to my training at my grandmother's knee, basically, and in my family, that you stand up for the right and you do what's right in terms of helping people not be oppressed. And that's just part of who I am. friend of mine in '89, we were talking. I had met him when I first came to San Francisco. Well, actually, when I came back to San Francisco, and we were talking, and he asked me if I'd ever been to the Russian River area. And I told him no, and he said, well, you have to go. One Saturday, we jump in his car and take Route 1 up to the Guerneville area. Guerneville is sort of like the central city at the Russian River. We had a very lovely drive up Route 1, of course, with the Pacific on the left, mountains on the little mountainous areas on the right. Beautiful the whole ride, and we get up to this area. It's sort of like San Francisco in the suburbs, so to speak. You know, it's country, a lot of redwoods, a lot of greenery, a lot of animals, all this wonderful, you know, quote, wildlife, unquote, and all of these, you know, gay men in these various resorts. And we went to one of the resorts and hung out for the day. And we just had a great time. It was great. You know, the drinks were great, the food was great, the people were great. And so I decided I got to come back to this place as soon as possible. And so about a month and a half later, I booked a cabin at the same place where we had stayed, and went for the weekend, and just started making friends. People were very friendly, very open, very welcoming. And, you know, I made a whole new cadre of friends at the river, in addition to my friends in San Francisco. And so I had another alternative place to go socialize and hang out. And so I did so for the better part of 2 or 3 years, from '89 to '91, '92. And then I was at one of the local bars, and I was talking with a guy there, nice guy, and we ended up spending some time together. And he mentioned to me that his landlords had a cabin for rent. His place was across the street from the cabin for rent, and it was this complex of 8 cabins, all around gardens and everything, gardens all around. And I went and talked to the landlords. They liked me, I liked them. And so, you know, within a couple of weeks, I moved in and began to furnish my little cabin at the river. I had a great time living there because, you know, I could spend all my weekends there if I chose, or I could spend my weekends in San Francisco at my apartment. A lot of times when I was at work, and I was doing a lot of work then in psychiatric emergency services, which could be very draining. And if I decided at 4 o'clock I wanted to go to my cabin at the river, you know, when I got off at 5, I was there by 6:30. And I could spend the evening, you know, I make myself some dinner, and I spend the evening sitting on my porch, you know, watching the deer come through the back gate, or the rabbits jumping around and gnawing on flowers, etc., or the raccoons and their kids running through, so to speak. And I just had a wonderful time. You know, it was relaxing. It was very, very country, which I loved. The neighbors were very friendly, very nice. And I just had a wonderful time. And my landlords we became very fast friends, and they took good care of me, believe me. So it was an idyllic lifestyle. I mean, there was a time from '92 to '93 where I didn't have to work for various reasons, and so I spent most of my time at the river, and I got to know people even better living there. The men were very welcoming. Again, in terms of socializing and, you know, finding people to spend time with, I had no difficulty at all. Again, I felt very socially and sexually secure there, felt very safe there. I loved it so much, even after I moved out of my cabin in 2000, after I bought my house in Oakland, I would still go back to visit and spend time with my landlord friends, and spend time hanging out at the main local bar, and, you know, just, you know, keeping my friendships going, and enjoying the cuisine up there, because they got great restaurants in that area. In fact, I was just there recently to do a retreat, and it brought back a lot of good memories for me to be at the Russian River again during that retreat. It so happened that we had to cut the retreat short because we were in the potential fire zone areas, so we had to evacuate early. So on my way out of town, I decided to stop at this Mexican restaurant and have dinner, and the dinner was exceptional, just wonderful dinner. The people were so nice. It just brought back again all those very positive memories I had about living there. That's where I said so long, to my partner, and everything. So those memories were there as well, and I just really love the river. The people are just exceptional, really exceptional, and it's a combination of gays, hippies from the '60s, and it's just a gamish, so to speak, a mixture of people that get along. I think it was most important for me to have the oasis of the river because I tend to get overly involved with respect to work, and it becomes difficult for me to take a break. Okay, and having the cabin at the river, knowing I had the cabin at the river, I always had an excuse to take a break, and being able to do so on a given evening, a given weekend, when I had my holidays, I could go there or I could come to Philly, really was important for me in terms of my mental and physical and spiritual health. Yeah, I moved back to Philadelphia in 2011. Being 68 and in a community that, let's face it, in all honesty, loves youth, I've slowed down a bit in terms of the socializing and going out to bars, etc. It took me a couple of years, actually, when I came home, before I really started going out socializing in the gay community. And I was fortunate in having a coworker who is gay. He and I were talking one day, and I came out to him, and he said to me, "Well, of course I'm gay," which I had suspected because, again, I have good gaydar. And we started talking, and he was saying, "Well, have you ever been out?" And I said, "Well, no, not really." So he said, "Well, let's go check out a couple of places." So one Saturday, we first went to the Tavern on Comac Street, and had a great time there, listening to the music. And then went over to the bike stop and, had a nice time there. And, he was saying, well, there are various other places around. He pointed out various places to me that, people go and everything. And I was very grateful and thankful, and made a mental record of these things in my head saying, I will go check these places out at another time. And several of them I have, in the ensuing, 6 years. Since I've been here, and I enjoyed going out. I enjoy being in the company of other LGBTQ people. So I go out less frequently than I used to, some years ago, for various reasons. And I find that I enjoy being around my house more these days. I find also that, given the fact that my mother's older, in her 90s, and needs assistance, that takes up a great deal of my time as well. I, have been involved in work within, my church, and so I just overall don't, as I say, don't go out as much as I used to. And I think part of it is, for me, it relates to being self-conscious about being older, because obviously the gay community is very much, LGBT community is very much focused on youth, and I don't feel as connected, I think, overall as I used to when I was younger. And I think a lot of that is my stuff, and I think a lot of it is just the stuff that's in the community, so to speak. So, my life is a lot quieter now, goes along a lot more slowly now. I think overall that, I'm happy and contented. That doesn't say that, I wouldn't like to make a connection with somebody or somebody's and have, a partner, I think I would. But I also think the reality is that I need to get out and about more if I were going to do that. And so, part of me is saying, well, you're older and you're slowed down now. Another part of me is saying, yeah, but if you want to make connection with people, you got to get out and get about, and connect with people. So I'm sort of having a little tug of war, if you will, between those parts. And I think the part that's winning is the part that's saying, I need to get out more, and I think I will be going out more because it's important for me to keep that connection. I went to a conference several months ago where the LGBT folk in the conference, got together and did some socializing. And I found it to be extremely exhilarating to be in a group of LGBTQ people out doing social things. And there's an affiliate group that is related to that group that I have recently joined. And I expect that, given the fact that I have joined that group, that I will be getting out more. I've joined the William Way Center here in Philadelphia and have gotten called by various of their staff about various social events that they have going on that I've been invited to. And so I think that's going to be another mechanism through which, I can get out and about and just meet people and socialize with people and let people know and see, what a special person I am. It's just very special being an LGBTQ male. And I love being around other people who share that description. And I don't want to lose that, because I spent a lot of time denying it and running away from it. And now I need to keep my connection and run to it. And I intend to do that.